Steve's going to watch the chat. If you have questions, you can put them there. If it's like urgent, he'll stop me. I'm also open to like, if you're like, wait, Rachel, I really need to know, just jump off mute and you can interrupt me. I'm happy to answer any questions you have during or after. So I'm in Colorado. I live in Denver. So just for those of you who are in Utah, just right over those little hills right there. And as Steve said, yeah, I've worked in the Agile world for a long time. I was a CST for a long time now, CST emeritus, which just means I'm not training anymore. Yeah, about a year and a half ago, I got the job that I have now. So before that, I had my own consulting company. I did a lot of work with executive teams, bringing the things we know about Agile and disciplined work to the senior leadership level of fast-growing tech companies, trying to help them, do a better job formulating strategy and deploying strategy and working together. Then I got offered this position, which I work inside of an investment firm. So I actually work in a financial company, which I've never done before. We have about 500 companies in our portfolio. So that is a lot of different companies that I get to work with. And I'm basically an advisor to help them as they grow their companies and support them. So it's a pretty cool job, actually. Very happy to be here with you. We are going to talk about the power of questions. I have been a facilitator for many years, working with executives. I ran a lot of exec offsites. I've also, when I worked at Rally, as Steve mentioned, for several years, led our internal strategic process. And so I ran our internal strategic planning meetings, which would be, with 100 people in the room trying to make corporate decisions. And so I've had a lot of chance to facilitate, and I've thought, and as a trainer, I've thought a lot about questions because I ask people questions all the time, and I've gotten really passionate about how we can use them in really effective ways versus having them be, at best sort of like an afterthought and at worst potentially destructive to the spaces that we're creating. So that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen. So thinking about questions within the space of coaching, training, facilitation, my guess is, given the work that I think most of you do, at least one of those is a space that you get to plan. I mean, I think for almost anybody with a job, at some point, you're going to be running a meeting at least. So hopefully these are relevant spaces to you. So what is the weirdest question you've ever been asked at work?
Are you wearing a kilt?
Nice. So while I actually think that's a fun question, the reason why I asked it for you is to demonstrate something that I call the 10-second rule. So when I asked you that question, after I finished, I counted in my head to 10 at this pace. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I didn't get your kilt thing until I was almost to 10. Now, me counting to 10, that probably felt like a long time, right? But did it feel that long to you when you were thinking about the question that I just asked you? Like, were you like, wow, it has been 5 years since she asked that, right? So our experience as the asker of the question and the time that passes before we start to get responses versus the experience of the people who are being asked the questions is quite different. And I think this is actually one of the simplest things you can do to change your experience with questions. I see this all the time where people will be in a meeting and they'll say, well, does anybody have any questions about this? Or does anybody have anything they want to add? Okay, next thing, right? And they wait 1 second and people are still processing. So this trick of actually doing this, and I do this all the time, where I ask a question and in my head, I try to count 10 seconds, is a really important practice, because what is happening on the other side when you count to 10 is a whole bunch of work, right? People might be trying to take a complex thought and turn it into a coherent statement, right? For some people, they think out loud. They're able to sort of start forming their sentence through their words. But for other people, they need that time to think about, how am I going to put the thoughts that I'm having into language that makes sense to other people? And we want to give them space for that. Maybe the environment is one where there are people with different levels of power or status. So people might be thinking like, I have something I want to say, but I want to think about the personal risk that I might be putting myself in of saying it. So maybe I'm trying to figure out, one, do I want to say it? And two, how do I want to say it? Maybe they're thinking about what are the personal reactions of the other people in the room? Like, am I saying something that's going to maybe potentially set someone else off or make them feel bad, right? So we're sort of assessing, doing kind of like situational awareness. And maybe we're just trying to make sense of your question, right? Mine kind of came out of nowhere, right? So you're like, wow, that's weird. Like, why is she asking me that? Just right off the jump. But sometimes if you're in a meeting, you could be like 3 agenda steps in. We did like we got a presentation, and then we had a conversation, and now we're talking about what that means for our team. You ask me what sounds like a simple question, and I have a bunch of sense making to do of all the other information that I've received in that meeting before I can formulate a coherent answer. So that tends to, like, if you took one thing away from this, I'd want it to be that, like, just it will feel weird to you, but it is a gift that you give to the people on the other side. Don't rush. Like, if you ask a question and you really want an answer, don't rush. By counting to 10, you will create the space, and I guarantee you people will start responding. Whereas if you say something like, does anybody have any questions? Okay, move on, right? Like, and I know you've all seen this in meetings where somebody does that, and then they're partly through moving on, and somebody's like, actually, wait, I do have something that now we have to go back and stop and reverse, right? And that's just because they needed that passage of time before they were ready to answer. Okay, so that's my little spiel on like any questions, they just need a little space. So what is it about questions that makes them hard? Because I think we've all experienced this moment where we're like, I'm just asking a question. Why is it hard? Why are people struggling either to understand what I was asking, or struggling to get responses? Or, maybe I asked a question and they're asking me 17 questions back, right? So what is it that makes questions hard? So I'm going to show you 3 different techniques that you can use to make your question spaces better. So one is a technique called empathy interviews. This is a technique you'll use for things that you are designing. I often use it for meetings. We're going to talk about how we use questions in facilitation. So in meetings, how do we design really good questions? And then we're going to talk about a technique called catalyst conversations, which is how do we have what are pivotal or important conversations with people where maybe the topics are tense, stressful, sensitive, and how can we use questions in those spaces to really create connection and movement forward? Because I think these are the places where questions become hard, and it's where the stakes are high, right? That's what makes questions hard, is that the stakes become higher, the risk is greater for a multitude of reasons, and that's where we need to be more thoughtful about how we use questions in our spaces. So let's start with empathy interviews. Has anybody heard of or used empathy interviews before? Is this familiar to anyone? Comes out of the world of design thinking. Jacob, I saw your hand go up. So yeah, this is from the world of design thinking, if any of you are familiar with that. So I didn't invent this. It was a technique I borrowed. I had the great benefit of learning about design thinking from a guy named George Kimball. We're going to watch actually a video of him in a few minutes. He was one of the founders of the D School at Stanford, where they developed this technique. And it's a technique used to help us understand what people are thinking, how they're feeling, what motivates them, so we can innovate for them. So that's why it comes from design thinking. The idea is like, how are we designing things for humans by really understanding the human experience around the need. So George, as I mentioned, this is George. He actually, I think he still lives in Colorado now. He moved out here a while ago. And he was one of the founders of the D School. And so I'm going to play this video. So this is a video actually from when I worked at Rally a million years ago. George came to a user conference we did, and he talked about empathy interview work that he had done at Stanford. So a class had come in to do the D School program, senior leaders from across industry, and he's going to tell the story of one of the people in the program and how this process of gaining empathy for his users really changed the course of the work that he was doing. So I'm going to hit play. Please tell me right away if you cannot hear or see what is happening.
Who knows what this is? Just MRI machine. Okay, what's it like to be an MRI machine? Awful, loud. You have to hold completely still, right? What? It's impossible to hold still. Yeah. So that's the MRI machine. It's really important in terms of understanding what's going on in the body. And Doug looked at this thing, and it's beautiful, and it works amazingly well. He considered himself really successful. He's very proud of his work. I mean, it's the type of thing you put on a brochure and put a logo on, and you feel really good that this is your product. But he came to the D school, and the way we learn design thinking is we have them do it, and I think we're redesigning the airport experience. They're like, well, you can't just think about that. Let's go to the airport and do this empathy work and prototype and things like that. And after those 3 days of including the design thinking process, he went away with this power of empathy, changing the way you think about the problem, and the importance of getting out and having that direct experience yourself. And he had always thought in the back of his mind that maybe he should go visit a hospital to see the product he used in action. And he did for maybe installations, but he never really with that mindset. So he decided, I'm going to go to the hospital. So he went to a neighboring hospital, and they opened up the door to the radiology department, and there's his machine. And he's feeling really proud, like the music is going on in the back of his head. But he just so happened to be there unexpectedly at the time that a little girl was getting a scan. So he's standing there, and the way he describes it, he's looking at his machine this way, and there's a hallway this way, and he sees the parents walking hand in hand with their little girl down the hallway. And he could tell immediately that there was a lot of stress. Like the parents, you don't know what's wrong with her, the little girl. The parents were worried, like, how are we going to get our daughter through this? The daughter had no idea. She's just walking along. He was there when they turned the corner into the radiology room. The moment they turned the corner, the little girl fell apart. The moment she saw his machine, she was terrified and was screaming and crying, and the parents are stressed, the doctors are stressed. It's a very tense room. It took a long time, and this little girl, like 80% of all kids who get an MRI scan, had to be sedated. And that moment, Doug had this personal direct empathy experience. He went from feeling really successful to a complete failure. He thought he was designing a scanner. He never once really put his mind in the eyes of understanding what's the experience like for this little girl. He didn't have that empathy. And so he decided right away he needed to figure out how to see the world through the eyes of the kid. So he partnered with like a children's museum director and patient advocacy groups, and it takes a long time to get funding in an organization that's big like GE, even as successful as that. And he just needed to get started. So he just did it himself, and he got these kids together like down on mats, and he asked them what their lives were like, and he was hearing stories like my older brother or sister went to camp or to the aquarium, and he realized all of a sudden he wasn't designing a scanner. He needed to design an adventure for these kids and a better way for parents to get their kids through this process. And all of a sudden that opened up what he thought he should be doing. And so he now, if you look, this is called the Adventure Series, and I think it was piloted in something like 12 different hospitals, and it's rolling out, and it's been quite successful. I'll tell you a little story. So now the kid at home gets I think something like a backpack. It's mailed to them, and the kid opens the backpack, the Adventure Series, and there's a little cartoon, and it tells about going to camp. And when you go to the hospital, you check in with the camp counselor, not the nurse. Even though it's a nurse, it just looks like a camp counselor. And then when you go into the room, they're like, let's go into your tent, because that's a tent, and you have to hold really still because there are animals outside. I don't know. And then instead of the kid saying, so why are you leaving to go behind that glass room? Instead of the technician saying, well, it's dangerous in here, I'm going to go hide behind that radiation-proof glass, they can say, you're in your tent, I'm going to the camper. Right? And so the kid is now in this experience of I'm going to camp, and they know what going to camp is because they've experienced it with the kids. And with nothing more than the type of quick prototyping of the type of decals that go on the sides of buses, he was able to create this whole experience. And then he got the hospital just to fund it, to demonstrate that it worked. And then it's just started to roll and gain momentum within GE. Now GE Energy is asking him to teach them how his team has worked. It's just, in terms of statistics, I believe the sedation rate has gone from something like 80% to almost 0. I can't give a specific number because I think that's called a medical claim, and you guys are still doing the research to do that. But they're getting better scans with no change of technology, but now the kids are holding still. The patient satisfaction rate is up 99%. The throughput in the hospital is up like 7%. It's pulled a significant amount of new business into GE that they didn't expect before, because these things would be in contract negotiations for like 3 years on the service agreement level. And now the hospitals are like, well, who has the Adventure Series? We'll just take that.
Okay. So
who knows what this is?
I don't need to start it again. All right, can you hear me again? Okay, so I love that story. It's just incredibly beautiful and exciting. And this, I wanted you to, you can't see it when he's on the screen, but these are the adventure series. They still sell them. You can go look them up. Doug, who he's talking about, actually did a TED talk about this if you want to hear more of Doug's story about what happened. But as a parent whose kid has had an MRI, I will tell you, like, this is incredibly moving, right? And I think probably most of us feel that, of like, what a change. And so I share this because this concept of empathy, it comes from being curious, right, about people's experience and what they need, and not working from an assumption that we know what they need. We know what they want. We know how to deliver it, right? Like, I think, I mean, I don't even know how many CSM classes I have taught in my career, right? But I could definitely walk into that space and be like, I know how this is going to go, right? Because I've done it so many times. And yet, each individual in my class is living a unique experience, having a unique moment. And so being thoughtful about questions and creating space and being ready for their responses, I think it doesn't matter how experienced you are in your space, there's always room to learn, there's always room to explore. So when I go back to my question, which was what makes questions hard, I think this is one of those things, which is that we especially when we are expert in the space, we can make a lot of assumptions about what people need, what people want, what motivates people, and we can lose that curiosity that we might need to really make the outcome for people and for ourselves as beneficial as it should be, right? Just like Doug, who was like, I designed the coolest MRI ever, and in like 1 second had his whole world blown up simply by going and trying to learn a little bit more and being curious. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit. So like this concept of empathy interviews, right? How does it really work? So you might be thinking to yourself, like, that's amazing, Rachel, but I don't design products. Maybe some of you do. And if you do, super cool. But I know, like, I'm not a product designer. I'm not getting this chance to go like rethink MRI machines or rethink software. That's not the work that I do or have done for a long time. So how do we translate this concept into a non-product design world? So I think about it like this. We are constantly designing. We're designing meetings, we're designing organizational transformations, designing teams, designing processes, structures, metrics, dashboards. Like, we design things all the time in our jobs, regardless of whether we work in quote unquote product or not. And I think that this technique holds a place to allow us to do that design work more effectively, and you know, give us that pause in our process of like, I'm an expert, I've done this a bunch of times, or I know what the answer is, and just give us a beat to say, like, do I really though? Are there some questions that I should be asking, some curiosity that I should hold that would allow me to do better work here? So the way you approach this work is that before you design, so anytime you notice yourself designing, do a few interviews, right? And that's sort of like, be Doug, right? Go to the space and learn a little bit more about what the people who are going to be using your designed product, whether that's a meeting or a class or a team structure or whatever it's going to be, what are they experiencing? What are their thoughts about this? And interviews are a great way to do that. So empathy interviews, typically when I use them, they're a 30-minute conversation. I show up with my questions designed in advance, but also flexibility to pursue topics if they come up. If at all possible, it's great to have a pair so somebody can kind of like furiously take notes while you're asking questions and engaging in conversation. That's not always the situation. And if not, then just be really good at typing, or scribbling down notes. But if you can bring a pair, it's great, because you want to try to capture their actual words, not your interpretation, as much as possible. And I'll explain why when we get to how do you process these empathy interviews. So for me, when I would design an executive offsite, as an example, I would sit down and perform 30-minute interviews with members of the executive team, but also other people in the organization who might be impacted by the outcome of that offsite. And I would ask questions to help me really think through, how are we going to make this meeting the best meeting possible? So when you're interviewing for empathy, you really want to ask questions that encourage stories. We want to know about the lived experience or expectations of the person. Don't suggest answers if you can help it, right? Don't lead the witness. 10-second rule, don't be afraid of silence. They might be processing. You might be asking them something that's hard for them to answer for some reason. Look for inconsistencies, right? If you're getting two answers that seem inconsistent, that can be really telling. Nonverbal cues, obviously in the world of remote work, it's a little hard to access that stuff, but as much as you can also sort of watch, people will often kind of give you body language that might tell them if something's making them uncomfortable or worried or excited. Stay on the same path of a question, right? Like if you get an answer that has you sort of scratching your head, don't be afraid to dig deeper. And then one thing that I really like to maintain, if I can, is confidentiality. So especially like if I'm going and talking to people about like a meeting that's coming up or a org structure we're thinking about, if I can say to them, I'm going to take notes, but I'm going to keep all of the information you share with me and my notes confidential. What I'm going to do instead is go across all my interviews and pull out thematic information to share back to the leaders of whatever I'm doing, but I'm not going to individually identify people. I find that I get a lot more honest conversation. So it's not always possible, but if I can get confidentiality agreement with the people I'm doing the work for, that can really be beneficial. And of course, if you're the owner of whatever thing you're building, whatever thing you're designing, it's yours anyway. So here, like this is when I do empathy interviews for meetings, I have sort of a go-to bucket of questions that I can pull from. I might innovate and create new ones, but these are some of the questions I might ask about a meeting. So first, I might start by telling them what is an empathy interview, tell them if I can that this is confidential, see if they have any questions before we begin. In a 30-minute interview, I'm typically not going to go through all of these, but I might say these are the 5 that I want to focus on. So what's not working well? That can be an interesting question to sort of probe at where are areas we might need to focus. If I've got a draft set of outcomes or agenda for the meeting, I might say, here's what I think we're going to do at the meeting. Is that the right work? Right? Have them tell me right away, like, I don't want to show up at this meeting with an agenda and have a bunch of people being like, God, why are we doing this? Right? Like, so if I can pre-check that, amazing. How well prepared are you for this meeting? That can be really interesting because people can be like, oh, that agenda looks good. And then say how well prepared and be like, not at all. Like, I feel like I'm going to have to do a whole bunch of work to get ready for this meeting and I don't have time for that. Like, well, okay, that's going to be a problem. We probably need to address that. And so I think thinking about what are some kind of key questions you might want to explore with people, showing up with your, 4 to 5 key questions you want to answer. And then I just use like a Google sheet and just record like person by person, kind of what are the answers. And then if there's sort of off the cuff things that they're sharing, I'll track that as well. And then I always like to end with that last question, which was, what else would you like me to know about that we haven't already discussed? And that just creates space for like, if they're holding something or they're, why didn't they ask me this? Or like, there's this thing that's bothering me. It gives them a chance to share that information with you. So what this then looks like is I get this big spreadsheet that I can then process through. So when I'm processing the results, so let's say I did 8 interviews, now I'm going to be looking question by question and seeing like, are there themes that exist? Are there outliers? Is there confusion, friction? I like to, I know it's a little violent, but in my mind, I use this terminology, like I'm trying to diffuse bombs. So meeting bombs are when somebody comes to your meeting and you're all prepared to run the thing like you think you're going to, and then somebody's like, I'm just going to dump this thing into the middle of this meeting and it's going to blow up our whole agenda. And now we're going to have to talk about that thing. And there's upset and frustration. And why didn't we know about this ahead of time? Right. So that's when somebody's kind of like holding something and they're going to show up. And it's not malicious. Typically, it's not like they wanted to blow up the meeting, but it's that we didn't know that they needed that resolved. And this is just the time when it's showing up. So if I can diffuse those things before they come in, everybody will have a better meeting. So in this example, you can see I asked, what would we need to walk out of the meeting with for you to feel we were successful? And repeatedly, I'm getting this message of like, what are our priorities for the next year? We're constantly having to negotiate anything. I need a bigger vision. I can't plan, every 3 weeks. Like we're burned out. I need foundational information, right? I'm just hearing this message over and over and over again. And it may be that this is what the leader hypothesized, right? They're like, I think we need to do this planning because we need a longer term vision. Great. I've just validated that. Your team is aligned. They all believe that's a problem too. But maybe the leader thought there's nothing wrong here. And now I'm able to surface something to them like, hey, you know what we really need to do in this meeting is this, because if we don't, your team is going to walk out frustrated that yet once again, they don't have a longer term plan, right? So this is just helping us either validate or learn something new about how to design the right meeting for this group of people at this time. So that's what processing looks like. Is just, and this is again why you want to capture their words as much as possible, because you want to try to find those things that help identify questions or concerns or elements that are unique to the environment that they're in. Once I've identified themes, then what I do is I make recommendations. So if it was my meeting and I'm the leader and I'm doing this, I make my recommendations to myself. But if I'm doing this in service to someone else, either as a coach or a consultant or a scrum master, right, I might go then to the leader of this meeting or this, whatever we're creating. And I would say, hey, based on my conversations, here's what I discovered and here's what I recommend. So this is based on another set of questions I asked. I started to see this theme that there was a lot of concern that the team was going to go into this planning meeting and that they had stakeholders in other parts of the business who were going to be out of alignment with whatever they came out of the meeting with, and that they were going to have to scrap it and go back to the drawing board. So they were sort of saying to me, I'm worried this meeting is going to be a waste of time. Right. And so, and this idea of the business. So this was like a product and tech group. And they're saying, what if, we build all these great plans and the quote unquote business says that's not what we want to be doing. So my recommendation in this case was either we need to have the stakeholders in the meeting, right? Like bring them along because they got to get aligned too, which could be hard because it makes the meeting a little bigger, maybe a little less safe because these are like the more senior executives, or we need to set up a follow-on conversation. We need to know going in that this meeting is a stepping stone. Planning part A, then go take it to the stakeholders. No, we may have to come back and do planning part B, but one way or another, we got to do that. We can't just go into this saying like, it's going to be one and done and no problem, right? And that did, in this situation, did cause us to really change the structure of the meeting and the flow of what we were going to be doing. All right, so that's empathy interviewing. I gave it to you an example of how you use it to design a meeting, but I imagine you could see how you would use it to maybe design a class, to design an org structure, to design an organizational transformation, etc. Steve, were you going to jump in?
I was going to say, there is a question that came in the chat just for clarification. Did you see it?
Yeah. No, I didn't.
Okay, I'll read it. Why
Okay.
do you feel the need to say that this is an empathy interview?
So I'm just using that language because that's what it is, because I borrowed the technique and the structure from the design school, and that's what they call it. So it's like it's a named thing. I will tell you that I've worked with some organizations where weirdly the concept of empathy made them feel squirrely. It's like a little more of like a hard organization, and maybe it made them feel exposed. And so I'm more than willing to like call it like pre-meeting interviews, Rachel's learning interview, I'll call it whatever, but I wanted you all to know that it's actually a described technique invented at the D school, and it's called an empathy interview. Does that help? Yeah, that's its name. Cool. And if you want to learn more about it, you can search empathy interview and you'll find all sorts of resources, tools, descriptions, etc., from people who did the work to develop this technique that you can use. So that's also helpful to know what it's really called. Okay. All right. So that's questions to learn ahead of creating something, which I think can be a very high risk space. So back to what makes questions hard, right? We're in high stakes situations. These are the way I use questions to sort of take high stakes situations and make them safer, make them more productive, make outcomes better. So now let's say we designed a meeting, or we created a space where we're going to do an org transformation, or we're working with a team on a retro or whatever it is that we're doing. And now we are actually having a meeting and having conversations about it. How might we effectively use questions in that space to achieve really good outcomes? And to me, this is about being clear and being relevant. So facilitation prompts, that's again, me being very specific with language, like empathy interviews. Facilitation prompts are the questions and the instructions that facilitators give to direct people to accomplish certain activities. So when you're in a meeting and you say like, break into 2 groups and brainstorm, that's a facilitation prompt. And I'm going to talk you through some techniques you can use to make those things even more effective, especially when you're doing more complex work inside of meetings or talking about high stakes, sensitive topics. So let's start with, what is the role of a facilitator? So when I say a facilitator or a facilitation prompt, what do I mean? So I mean, it's when you're in a role inside of a multi-person event, typically a meeting, your role is to enable people to work more effectively. So you're trying to create a space where people can be more effective in the work they're doing. It's best as a facilitator if you can be what I call content neutral, which means whatever the outcome is, you're okay with it. You just want to make sure we get to an outcome. So we don't always get the benefit of not having a, dog in the race when it comes to the outcome. Sometimes we are both a facilitator and a vested participant. But as much as possible, when we're in facilitator role, we want to be content neutral. Like I don't care what the outcome is. I just want to make sure we get to the outcome. And I think about this as making and holding space in which people can get their job done, right? Get the work done. So to me, that's the role of a facilitator. So why would a facilitator ask a question, right? If that's my job, make and hold space, make sure we get to an outcome, be content neutral. Well, I think for 3 reasons you would ask a question. 1 is to test for understanding. Do I understand? Do you understand, right? Communication is not always as frictionless as we would like it to be. You might ask to test for readiness to move forward, right? Are we done with X so we can move on to Y? And also to elicit responses, right? Presented information. What do people think about that, right? So these are the 3 reasons why I think we would ask questions. So I'm going to dig into each of them and explore what really valuable, powerful questions can look like. So if I'm testing for my understanding, meaning I'm the facilitator, one technique to use is to do paraphrasing and reflective listening. So remember, if we're trying to be content neutral, we don't want to be giving our opinion because we're not supposed to have one, right? Our only goal is to get them to a state of done. So paraphrasing, reflective listening, which those types of techniques, which I'm sure many of you, most of you, all of you are familiar with, is trying to reflect back what you think they said, right? So if somebody says, well, this is all great, but I don't think it's really going to help us. Okay, it's like, ooh, that's a thing. You might say back, okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is that the work we've done has been valuable in some ways, but it's actually not going to help us achieve our goals. Is that right? Right? Like tell them what you think they said, because by doing that, you're opening space for them to say more or to clarify if you got it wrong, right? Especially when it's those types of sort of like spiky comments that we sometimes get. That's a really important place to like, I think a lot of our, natural reaction is like run away from that. Like, okay, that was painful. I'd rather just like move on to the next thing. But if you leave that thorny thing there, it might not allow us to get to done. So sometimes we have to confront that, and doing it in that reflective listening or paraphrasing way is a fairly non-confrontational way to confront, if that makes sense. We also might need to acknowledge feelings. Sometimes things get heated in meetings, get heated when we're working together. And you can say, you're probably thinking you know how the person is feeling, so call that out and see if you're right. Sounds like you're really frustrated. Is that right? Right? Are they frustrated, or is it something else going on? And oftentimes, again, by naming the way someone's feeling, they can articulate more why they're feeling that way instead of just like being in their feelings about it. Testing for their understanding. Maybe you want to know if people have more questions or need more information. And so just again, being very clear about that. Notice the difference between the language on the top and the bottom. So it's nuanced, but there's a big difference between saying, what questions do you have versus are there any more questions? Because what questions do you have suggests that there are some. Are there any more questions suggests there may be one, but there might be zero. Right. And to be honest with you, if I'm getting like a lot, like we're just kind of like in like, now I've got a really chatty group and they're just kind of like going on and on. I may do, are there any more questions to help us move forward? Because it is a way to sort of suggest like what other information do you need? Do you need anything else? Right. That are those two bottom questions, the correct answer to those is binary, yes or no, versus the top two, which are expansive. Right, which suggests there's like a universe of information. So thinking about how we frame a question and what we're trying to drive towards is really important. And this requires us to like be really cognizant of what we're saying, right? This takes some work training. You're going to step on your own toes every once in a while. Don't worry about it. But even just beginning to notice, do I have a tendency to say, any more questions? And how often could I replace that with what other questions are there? Right. And just watch for yourself the difference in response that you get. And when you say what other questions are there, what are you doing next? Counting to 10 slowly in your head. Because now you've just said to people, I think you have questions. Do you have questions? Dig in your brain, go find one. So they got a little thinking to do to get there. All right. So testing readiness to move forward. One thing I like to do is actually turn my agenda into questions. So instead of just having like a bullet pointed list of topics we're going to cover, can I turn those into questions? Because then I can, at every step of the agenda, I can say, has this question been answered? If yes, we get to move on. If no, we're still in this part of the agenda. So here's an example. On the left is just a bulleted agenda, project scope, obstacles and risks, team assignment schedule, right? This can just be like a project meeting where we're talking about like, what are we working on? Anything we're worried about, who's working on what's the schedule of when we're going to meet? If you go to the right, we get these questions. What is the scope of the project? When we have the answer to that, we are now ready to move on to step 2. So for me as a facilitator, it's a really great way to make sure I know we're ready to move on, that we haven't kind of left something undone. And you get the recording of this, but I'm also happy to share my slides. So if you want to grab any of these examples, you can have them. The other thing you might be doing as a facilitator is eliciting responses. So this is bringing information into the room. So same thing that I've been kind of hitting on with these other examples is try to draw people out, try to ask open-ended questions, try not to, give them this example where the answer is a binary, but instead there's a whole universe of potential answers there. So drawing people out, this can be helpful if you have quiet people in the room, people who you maybe haven't heard of recently, and then encouraging, trying to create space, trying to show that you welcome the idea that there are more questions, not that you're feeling rushed and want to move on. So we can also do structured activities to get responses from people. This is a technique actually I borrowed from my mentor, a woman named Jean Taveka. She was amazing. She knew more about facilitation than anybody I've ever met. And she designed this structure to get into activities in meetings where what you're trying to do with people can be somewhat complex. And it's called prepare, prompt, gather, process. So I'll go through each of these briefly to try to explain this, how it works. But again, I'll share my slides so you can practice it on your own if you want. So oftentimes when you're facilitating a meeting or a class or whatever you're doing, I'm sure you've all run into this where you give people the instructions and you're like, okay, go do it. And then they're like, wait, what? What are we doing? Wait, hold on. What? I don't understand. And you're just like, it's a total mess. And then you spend like 5 minutes cleaning it up, right? And part of that is just the way that our brains work and the order in which you've presented information has caused some confusion. So this structure alleviates that. It's going to feel a little arduous and weird, but I encourage you to try it. Every time I've used this, it works so much better than me just sort of winging it and trying to give people directions. So here's an example that you could use virtually. So this is the first step. This is the prepare. What I'm going to do is give them the directions of what we are going to be doing, but I am not giving them the information of what we're talking about. The challenge here is as soon as you give them what you're talking about, they're starting to think about it. So if like the question is, how are we going to organize as a team? They can't hear anything after I say that. All the instructions I give them of like, I'd like you to write it on stickies and try to come up with 3 or 4 and work in groups of 3. Like they're not hearing you because they're already thinking about how are we going to organize as a team. So you're going to hold back that critical piece of information of what you want them to talk about and instead focus them on the mechanics of the work itself. So we're going to do a brainstorming activity. We're going to brainstorm for 7 minutes, and then we're going to spend 20 minutes reviewing what each group came out with. We're going to work in groups of 4. If there's an uneven number of people, we can have a group of 3. I'm going to use Zoom breakouts. Does anybody need help on how Zoom breakouts work, right? Like I am just like logistics, because we got to get all that out. It's much less interesting than the question I'm going to ask. But if we don't understand this part, it's going to be a disaster. So prepare is how are we going to do the work? Make sure that's clear first, right? Then we get to a readiness statement. Are you all ready? I'm going to give you the question and you give them a brief reminder. We're going to have 7 minutes. We're going to be in Zoom breakouts. We're going to come back together. Before I ask you the question, does anybody have any problems with the mechanics of the activity, right? Like just make sure it's clear. And half the time you're going to get somebody who's going to be like, how many people are in each group again? 4, 3 is okay. Okay, great, right? Ready to move on. Now we finally do the prompt. And this is really important that we have a very clean prompt. So we start by setting the stage. What is the context in which you want them to think about this question? So think about the need for cross-functional skills on this project that we discussed earlier in the meeting. Think of the work we'll be asking this team to accomplish and the ways that work can impact multiple parts of the business. Now they finally get the question. Now, what are the key elements we should consider when designing this team, right? Now everybody's got context. They understand how this fits within the structure of the rest of the meeting, the other information we have, they know how to work, boom, ready to go. So that's prepare, that's prompt. There's an example for an in-person prepare in here that you can look at if you are back to in-person meetings or live in a place where that happens because you work with your colleagues in the same location. I do not, I'm still in virtual land. And then you finally get to gather and process. So I didn't go into the details of those here because they're not questions, but gather is doing the work, right? They're like off in their breakout groups doing it. And then process is the 20 minutes we spend when we come back, hearing what they all did and deciding what to do with that information. But for the question piece, that prepare and prompt to me is going to save you a lot of pain, especially when you're doing complex activities, which I would guess some of you run into. So. Okay, I'm trying to be conscious of time. So last piece, I wanted to talk about questions to inform and empower people. So this technique of catalyst conversations, some of you may be familiar with this. Steve and I, this was the Agile Leadership Journey work he was talking about. This is a technique we learned there and we use. This is a technique to have conversations when you're in high stakes environments with one other person typically. So maybe you're doing a one-on-one, maybe you're giving someone feedback, maybe you're receiving feedback, maybe you're, trying to have a conversation with somebody you're in conflict with. But it's a technique, a structured way to have a high stakes conversation. And I like to think about how can we use questions in this environment instead of guiding with statements, because I think questions are a space of curiosity and create openness and show the other person that we really do want to engage with them on what can be a challenging topic. So this first step is aligning objectives. This is where we would start a catalyst conversation. And it's really about making sure we're both here to talk about the same stuff. And so key questions you might ask there are, here's what I want to get out of this conversation. What do you want to get out of this conversation? Just that little technique can really change the dynamics of conversation. I try to do this in almost every conversation I have with people when I'm at work. I jump on a call with somebody and we know what the call is about, but maybe we scheduled it 2 weeks ago. Things might have changed. And so I'll jump on the call and I'll say, hey, it's so nice to get to chat with you. I think this is what we're going to talk about. Are there any other topics or has anything changed on your side that would cause us to want to have a different conversation today? Huge, right? And it creates this space where that person's like, wow, they really care about why I'm here, right? And also it helps me make sure we're not having the wrong conversation and wasting each other's time. You can also ask how urgent it is. Do you need anyone else involved? Anything we need to do to do some aligning right up front. Then we want to explore perspectives. So again, if this is a high stakes conversation, we may feel differently about this situation, right? We may have different perspectives on what's going on. And so this is a place, so in this picture, what you'll see is the box is the topic. The person you're talking with, they are going to want to talk about this topic, maybe why they're mad at you, or why they don't like the decision you made, or why they're worried about something, or why they, the feedback you're giving them isn't relevant to them. You want to try to stay focused as much as you can on them. Don't talk about the box, talk about them. How do they feel about this? What have they done about this? How long has this been going on for them? Why does it matter to them? Focus on them, not on the thing. By doing that, we move the conversation into what does this mean for our relationship, not the problem solving of the thing. Because if it's high stakes, probably what's at risk here is our relationship. It's not so much the thing. The thing is like a symptom of the bigger problem, which is how is this impacting us and our ability to work together and to move forward here. Clarifying understanding, again, it's about them, not about the thing. I mean, if you don't understand the thing, you can ask questions about it. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Definitely get clear on that. But once we understand that, we are back to that paraphrasing, reflective listening. How are you feeling about this? It seems like there's a lot going on, right? Like, explore that, make space for that, help them help you know what's really going on for them. Don't make assumptions about it. And now once we've done that, we are actually at a place where we can share some insight and wisdom, where we can learn with each other. So maybe you're reminding me of a situation. Does that relate to the situation you're experiencing, right? Like, it's making me think of this thing that happened to me. Is that relevant to you? I always try to be really careful here. You see my note there, don't give advice. I'm always very cautious with giving advice, because giving advice is what I call a power move. When I give you advice, I am telling you that I know more about this than you do. I am putting myself in a power position, right? Like, I have more experience, I have more knowledge, I have something you don't have. Now, there are plenty of situations where advice is useful, but I always try to be careful and think through before I give advice. Is this a situation in which my advice will be helpful? Or does this put me into a power position with the person that I'm not trying to create right now? So that's where something like, let me tell you my personal experience with this, is that relevant for you, versus you should do what I did, right? It's not your thing. So maybe they shouldn't do what you did, but you can share with them what you did and see if that's helpful to them. There's a nuanced difference there. And then lastly, empowering action. So ending these types of conversations with more questions. Is there a way for us to move forward? What do you think your next step is? What do you think my next step should be? Right? Again, asking questions, empowering them to tell you what they think, what they feel about it, so that you're not just directing and solving and guiding. Okay, so sorry, that last part was a little rushed. Just trying to make sure we get to the end before the top of the hour. So synopsis of everything here. So 3 techniques for powerful questions. Before you even get started, before you even design, before you even structure, is there curiosity that you have that you could address by going out and talking to a few people, spending 1, 2, 3 hours, digging in a little bit to learn more before you design? When you're in the space of actively working on something, are there ways that you could be framing your questions to create more openness, create more learning, more opportunity, helping people move forward, not leaving those little thorny barbs unaddressed? Undressed would be weird. And then lastly, if you are in high stakes or high friction environments, how can we use questions to create relationship, understanding, safety, so that we can move together towards a better outcome? All right, sorry, I'm gonna stop there. I didn't leave very much time for questions, but maybe 1 or 2 if I can be really speedy.
Hey, Rachel, what's the difference between advice and suggestion?
So I think advice is when we say, you should do X, right? My advice is do X versus the example I'm giving, which is in a situation that feels similar to me, I did X. Is that meaningful to you? Right? I'm not saying you should do it because it's your situation isn't my situation, but maybe this is helpful to you. So it's just the nuance of, I'm not telling you to do it. I'm offering it as a potential option, but it's up to you whether that's something you would do or not. Again, like there are places where advice is great. I just am always like, I always try to think, is advice useful here? Or would it be better just to say it in a way of like, here's an option. What else? Other questions?
We've got a
No.
suggestion.
Yeah. Here's what I'm telling you. Don't give advice, David.
Yeah.
That's my advice.
Question was between the advice versus suggestion, or do they kind of package the same if you did that in a single conversation?
Yeah, I think it's just the way you present it, right? Of like, it's honoring the fact that your experience is not their experience and that your context is not their context. And so while you may have an example that is relevant, they need to ultimately be in ownership of whether or not they implement it.
Okay, great.
But when we give someone advice, what we're saying is, I know more and you should do what I said. Right? We don't have to take it that way, but that's how it can come across. Well, it was lovely. Sorry that we ran out of time, but lovely seeing all of you. And like I said, Steve, I'll give you my slides, which you can share out. So nice getting to chat with all of you, and have a lovely rest of your week. Don't melt.